Thank you everyone for your patience and for obeying Trevor's orders for those in Bundoora for walking down and making more of a crowd for our cinematic experience. I'm Sue Martin, I'm the Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research for the College of Ask, and on behalf of the College I'd like to welcome you to this event. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the original owners of the land on which this campus is built, and pay respects to their elders past, present and future. I'm very pleased and excited to welcome Professor Craig Calhoun to speak to you tonight and to use our equipment, which is working. Craig is the director of the Berggruen Institute in California. That's a think tank with kind of amazing potential, which he may speak to you about either during or after the presentation, so I won't go into that. A former director of the London School of Economics until 2016 when he moved to the Berggruen Institute, and former president of the Social Science Research Council in the US as well, so an extremely distinguished guest for us. A great proponent of cross-disciplinarity, as we heard earlier today, and author and editor of an amazing array of publications, editor of the Oxford Dictionary, the Social Sciences, author of an extraordinary book on Tiananmen Square. Tonight he's going to be talking on populism, polarization and democracy, as you can see, so I won't hold him up any longer. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here in Bundoora. It's a pleasure to greet those who are online from various other campuses. And since we're starting late, I'm going to go straight into this with no further preamble, only the apology for the late start. I'm not going to talk about the Institute as such. Feel free to ask questions later. I'm going to talk about one of the clusters of pressing issues of our time, which is the ways in which faith in democracy has been challenged. I think that the root issue here, the issue isn't defined by the word populism. Populism is one of the things that happens when people's faith in existing institutions and democratic processes gets challenged. And this is one of the transformations of our era. After a long period of time when we were more at ease talking about progress and feeling confident in it, when we were more at ease saying that we simply needed more democracy, we are now confronting a variety of people with different sorts of challenges, often embracing democracy, but then questioning whether it should be the liberal democracy that we've often been familiar with, or whether there is some tension between the idea of popular participation and popular sovereignty and the idea of an institutionalized set of compromises in which different points of view in a plural society are all represented. Populism is an imprecise label. It's a political term that is used as often as an accusation as it is claimed by people. People do say sometimes, I'm a populist, I speak for the people, I speak in the name of the people. But at the same time, populist is a kind of accusation, an accusation that people are short-circuiting in some way the necessary rational analysis of politics, or the recognition that politics is just part of a story that also involves economic and financial and other aspects. The accusation populist is particularly likely to be made by those who believe in the knowledge of experts and wish to say that we need a reasoned, rational debate among experts to guide us, rather than a broader appeal to the sense of the people. But the idea of populism isn't meaningless just because it's used as an accusation. That's a confusion that we need to think about. But this idea of appealing to the basic moral standing of the people is important. Now, I'm going to say that it's much more complicated than most populist politicians will say, but I'm not going to say that it's bad or irrelevant or meaningless. To start with, just take the notion of the people, which I will come back to. It's less obvious what that means than it sounds. Saying in the name of the people, right, raises a question. The people, right? A people, some people, most of the people. How does this work? What is the representation of the people that's involved? Often, appeals to the people actually are appeals in the name of all the people against some of the people. Those elites who are betraying the rest of the people, right? Or those people who are native born and really legitimate against those who've arrived more recently, immigrants. Or sometimes the people against the bureaucracy, against the impersonal systems of government and finance that we've created that frustrate us and sometimes fail to deliver what we want, against people we think have inferior claims to our own, to the goods that our countries have to offer. And populism is often closely related to nationalist appeals. I won't go into that very much, but I think it's worth noting, A, how close they are right now, and B, that they're not the same thing. We have two words for a reason. And the idea of the nation, right, has important resonance in places that aren't as typically the object of populist politics, because populist politics is particularly strong in democracies or countries that aspire to be democracies, though as we'll see, there are questions about this. Very importantly, populist politics is an appeal not just to the people as a population, but to the people as the legitimate participants in a way of life. Right? This idea of a way of life will come back, culture in that sense. I'll use the term several times, but what I mean by it is just the everyday sort of anthropological sense of a way of life. People who share a culture and thus a way of relating to each other, a way of understanding how they fit together in families and communities, as well as at the large scale of whole countries. And therefore, people who may worry that in one way or another, their way of life is being undermined or challenged. And this is important for thinking about populism because, as I'll come back to at the end, populism isn't just a politics of interests. In fact, it is in tension or in opposition to the idea of interest groups. We also have a notion of everyday politics a lot of the time, that there are the trade unions and there are the businessmen, there are the people from the West and the people from the East, there are urbanites and there are people in rural areas, and each of them has some interests to be fulfilled in politics. Some of them will benefit from a tighter financial policy, some of them from a looser, and so forth. That idea of interests, in a sense, divides the people. Now, within the vocabulary of interest, we can say we're going to find our common interest and have a politics of compromises among different interest groups. Find something that will work pretty well for people in the countryside or the interior, and people that will work pretty well for people in the cities or on the coasts, but won't be all one or the other. This is what populism challenges with a discourse of all the people, united in a sense, and thus somehow outside of the need for that kind of politics of compromises and diversity, but defending the people against changes that may hurt them or offend them. Populism, I want to stress early on, can be positive. I need to stress this early on because populism is often assumed to be inherently negative. Right? It's just bad, and many times in the media people use it as the danger of populism, the threat of populism. But it can be good in various ways. The man in the picture here with the white hairs, William Cobbett, one of my favorite populists, a early 19th century Englishman, and he would have said English, not British, an Englishman, right, who appealed for the rights of the people, for better treatments of the people, in an era when there were threats, he thought, from the crown in misguided ways, from finance. It was the era when the Bank of England was first made the kind of institution it has become as a public institution, and bonds were used to pay for the Napoleonic Wars. He evoked the people in a way that became crucially important to many things we value. He was one of the great figures in the background to Chartism, and to calls, therefore, for things like free public education for the people, for calls for the freedom of the people to organize and assemble, and potentially organize trade unions and other rights. I won't go on about Cobbett. This isn't a talk about the 19th century. The other one, Jules Michelet, wrote about the people in France, in this case, in the wake of the 1848 revolution, trying to give an account of how all the people in all their different roles, their different occupations, right, their different political opinions, were bound together as France, and how, therefore, France needed to both recognize and serve all the people, which is a core theme. Claims made in the name of the people are basic to democracy. In the United States context, the phrase, "we the people," is instantly familiar as the opening phrase of the preamble to the US Constitution. Okay? The idea is that the country is made by the people. Part of the opposition to monarchy in the US and the idea of republicanism everywhere is the idea that the people, united, can make their own government and their own way of life. Not just vote every 4 years for who's in charge, but create the government. And so the Constitution is an appeal to the active power of the people to do this. But there's a catch. Appealing to the people at large, outside of institutions, outside of regular political processes, is always open to demagogues, always open to manipulation in the media or in other ways, because the people are not tightly organized. They aren't assembled in one room for a discussion, an assembly. Right? They're dispersed and they're engaged in different things, and they are caught occasionally through the media or through political campaigns or in other ways. And so there's always the potential for a slippage between the ideal of all the people sharing and various kinds of representations that fall short of that and manipulations of what that means. There's been some of this going on lately. There's a lot of this sort of populism in various places. 2016 was a banner year for populism, and it shaped the Brexit campaign in Britain, shaped the election of Donald Trump in important ways. Marine Le Pen lost in France, but lost with over a third of the vote. Right? It's not a humiliation. And in the French case, 44% of the youth vote. This was not the past voting against the future. Le Pen carried only 20% of pensioners, but 44% of people between 18 and 24. Right? There are other cases in Germany and Italy, in India, and in Russia, and we have cases even closer to home. Right? It's not just right-wing movements. One of the confusions about populism today is to equate it with the right wing, to think that only the right wing tries to speak for the people, and in this direct way, and to speak around conventional politics to the people directly, which is an important part of the populist appeal. But leaders like Iglesias and Spiros in Spain and Greece are doing this, right? Others, again, debate, controversy. I don't know enough to get into it about whether you should call Shorten a populist or not, but I will say Bernie Sanders was a populist of the left, is a populist of the left. I suspect there are commonalities. Populism isn't new. The discussions of populism sometimes focus so much on what's going on today that you get the idea that this just came into being. But this is at least as old as the idea of democracy in this. And it has some recent historical precedents that are important. There's no accident in the fact that Donald Trump often refers to President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, in the US context, because the Jacksonian democracy of the early 19th century was also an attempt to be populist. And I'm stressing again that there's a positive side to this. I'm not telling you who I voted for, though you can probably guess, but I'm going to say there are some positive things. One of the things that both Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump did was bring into the political process a lot of voters who had never voted before or did not vote regularly. So one of the ways in which they were appealing to the people was to appeal to people who weren't feeling that they were represented by political parties or by conventional political processes, to change a bit who voted. Something's changing a bit my PowerPoint here. There's a more famous late 19th century episode of the populist movement in the US, which is overwhelmingly a movement of farmers who think that the way progress is getting defined in America leaves them out of the picture, and that they need to unite, that they are the real people of America, and that policies made in and for people in cities and for industrial interests and corporate interests aren't serving them. Perón in Latin America, I mean Juan, but also Eva, if you've just seen Evita, you've got a sense of it. The Argentine populist movement was a long and relatively strong political movement with deep roots in trade unions, links to rural areas, and an attempt to unite against a narrow oligarchy. There are a variety of more left campaigns in Latin America, and indeed, in European history, there are the famous extremely right-wing populist movements, but there are also more important left-wing movements and examples. So Brian, notice the idea here that we are overcoming, says Evita Perón, overcoming, right, silence. We are leaving behind, despite 100 years of silence, and now the people will get voice. One nation, justice, liberty, and sovereignty, right? All of this is an important message. That there are mass crowds is important. One of the features of populist politics is appeals to things that make people feel like they are the people assembled, all together. And a gigantic crowd, like Rally at Nuremberg, right, can evoke that sense of the people. Now, no crowd like that is big enough to actually include the millions and millions of people of most modern countries, right? But it gives the people who participate a feeling of being with the people, like the Levée en masse in the French Revolution. Current discussion is pretty ahistorical, and there are some things that we miss because of that. Right? It encourages the view that populism is always rightist. It's not, as I've said. Encourages the view that it's always wrong. Often it's been important to pushing democracies to do better. Encourages the view that it's just a short-circuiting of a viable conventional politics, and that populists don't have a positive agenda. Okay? Especially, it encourages attention to the leaders. And we often are made to think populism is just a creature of the manipulative leaders. There are manipulative leaders, there are demagogues, but populism often has roots that are deeper than those leaders. The leaders' appeals work because there is a cultural and social resonance to them in all of this. We also tend to look at one national story at a time, and part of what's important about the pictures I just showed you, and I could have added several more to that, is how many instances there are right now, which is a reminder that something's going on globally. Right? It's not just the national story of the US or France or Britain or Australia. It's a story of a moment in globalization when there is a lot of pushback from people who feel it's not working for them in various ways, when destabilizing socioeconomic change is causing us fundamental problems. It's putting pressure on our ideas of who we are. It's making us ask, what's happening to our way of life? Will our children live in societies that are recognizably still the kind of societies that we know Will they have opportunities? Will they be prepared to seize them? When people think that they or their children may be losing out, they tend to ask who's winning. And a feature of populist politics is often a search for scapegoats, or the people who are winning but shouldn't be, or are winning more than they should be, perhaps at my expense. There are material issues that exacerbate anxieties and create problems in this, but I want to stress that there are both cultural and material issues, and populism can't be understood in the logic of interest groups. It's not that poor people join populist campaigns because elites are rich. One of the things that has baffled many in America is they look at Donald Trump, a billionaire, and they say, how can these people who are complaining about the injustice of inequality like rich people? But it's often the case that populists don't like the professional classes, but do actually have a certain respect for rich people, even robber barons, the pirate capitalists of the era. There's a complex issue here, but it's a reminder that this is not just a self-interested expression of people who don't have something, who want it. It's often the case that people who have a lot are worried about losing it and are the key people in such movements. So who are the people? Here's another crowd, pretty different from Nuremberg, it's all together. This is the Republican convention that nominated Donald Trump. Right? So a huge gathering of people, right? Another sense of being the people, everybody's here together. If we were able to zoom in, we would see some groups of people are represented more than others. The crowd is more white, less black, more Anglo, less Hispanic, and so forth and so on. But it gives its participants a sense of joining as the people. But appeals to a transparently available shared we are tricky. They depend on cultural processes that make us think we have a mental image of the we, of the people, of who's involved. They are never just counting of the votes. They are never just accurate representations of the various plural and differentiated groups in modern societies. And they become particularly important in contexts of polarization, where people live in somewhat different versions of the same country. In the United States, there is a level of political polarization that is extreme. I'm not going to say unprecedented, although I actually think it's the most extreme it's been, certainly since we've been able to measure it with opinion polls and things. This is often represented by red states and blue states, right? And the point is that there is a geography to it, but there's also an element of social differentiation that makes it the case that people don't just bump into people with really different views. A common feature of the American election, the Brexit campaign, and others, I happen to be living in, it's probably all my fault, I was living in Britain for Brexit, I'm living in the US now, moved there just in time for Trump. But one of the features of each of those contexts was the number of people who said, I don't even know anyone who voted the other way. Right? In the case of Brexit, there were any number of people in the northeast of Britain and in certain generational and occupational groups who didn't know anyone who was voting to stay in the EU. And there were any number of people in London who didn't know anybody who was voting to leave the EU. And the same thing was true in the US. And there is an underpinning to this. This is partly a story of media and the way in which contemporary media are organized so that people can watch different ones. To give a sort of very summary picture of this, 50 years ago, indeed 30 years ago, there was mass viewership of a small number of television channels which broadcast things like the evening news. And if anything, the complaint against them, when I was a student, for example, was that it was pretty much the same. ABC, NBC, and CBS showed the same news. Yes, you got a different anchor person you might like better or worse, but it was pretty much centrist. Right? Well, what happens over time is both the decline of the audience for that kind of mass news, the rise of other kinds of much more differentiated channels, so that different people could get different accounts of the news to a much stronger extent. And this would shape what I call parallel media worlds, living in different versions of the country, getting different news stories of it, even though you're still in America. But the geographic segregation then reinforces that. And other things are going on. I will give one example that to me is compelling. And again, almost personal. When I was a student during the era of the Vietnam War and large-scale protests, one of the targets of the protest was programs that educated future military officers on university campuses, reserve officers training programs. ROTC off campus, many shouted, and indeed won the battle. The training of military officers was almost completely removed from elite universities in the United States to a combination of specialized military institutions and non-elite universities that were willing to do this without student protest. The result was that we segregated to an increasing degree the training of the elites who are going to be military officers and the elites who are going to be lawyers and doctors and other sorts of professionals. And this was reinforced by the end of the draft. I was personally against the draft. And yet, right, what a draft meant, what a requirement that everyone serve meant, is that during the Vietnam War, everyone knew someone who died in Vietnam. And what happened in the all-volunteer army is that participation came to be a matter of very disproportionately rural whites, urban blacks, Mexican immigrants, a variety of groups for whom it was an economic option faced with problematic employment prospects, or possibly a patriotic option, but fundamentally set apart from large parts of what would become the illiberal elite of the society. We created something like a caste system. So we, in many ways, made some of this polarization by a set of policies. I like to think I had good intentions in imposing the Vietnam War and opposing the draft, but good intentions can have problematic consequences. And one of them in the US was to contribute to this dividing of the country. More to that story, but it's important. You can reflect on the extent to which there is or isn't a similar issue of parallel media worlds are not here. But it's also important to think about prejudice in a not conventional sense. We use the word prejudice often just to mean illegitimate bias. You're prejudiced means that somehow you have a fixed view that can't be changed and that's illegitimate. So we use it always to mean bad. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer has argued that we should think about prejudice again and recognize first that we're all prejudiced, not just in the sense that, well, we all have groups that we struggle to like more than others, but in the sense that we all have convictions, ideas, culture that we haven't subjected to critical reason, and we can't subject all of it to critical reason. Right? So that it's an impossible ideal to have pure reason guide our lives entirely, to be guided only by reason. Right? That might be possible for artificial intelligence in machines, but people always have a background of culture. I'm going to guess the machines will too, but that is things that we understand without having critically examined them because they've just always been part of who we are, this way of life that I described. Though it will turn out to be ways of life because different groups in the society have different ways of life, each of which they may understand as natural, as simply the Australian or American way of life, even though there are others. Or they may understand it as good or right or proper. But in any case, we all have incompletely examined prior understandings, and we need to have them. There is no possible project by which we could get rid of all of these things. We can, one by one, change some of them or learn something different, but in fact, to have a common culture is to participate in received understandings. So we might want to make it better, but we shouldn't want to imagine that we can dispense with it. Appeals to the people, right, commonly play on this level of omnipresent bias in ways that embrace exclusions. So an irony of populism is that populists are commonly suspicious of some of the people. Say, I stand for the people, and those people over there can't be trusted, right? I stand for the people, some of whom are immigrants, say the people whose grandparents were immigrants. Right? I defend the people against various imaginary fifth columns, various potential internal threats, as well as against foreign threats. So there's an incorporation of a high level of suspicion, of anxiety, sometimes even of paranoia, into the thinking of this. Legitimate grievances may be embedded in very bad accounts of what's going on. Okay? Breitbart is a current US version of this, not uniquely US. If you look in the corner, you can see Breitbart London on the masthead here. Breitbart aspires to be international, though mainly US. This is the so-called alt-right publication. The news, like birth control makes women unattractive and crazy, is what some people call fake news, though there's a lot of debate about who gets to say which news is fake. Steve Bannon, the former editor of Breitbart, who's a senior advisor to President Trump now in the White House, has been part of weaving an alternative narrative, which he would say this is his job. He has been weaving an alternative narrative. The mainstream liberal press, the New York Times narrative of what it means to be American, he says, is deceitful. This is part of the Donald Trump story. They're lying to you, right? Here's the truth. But the demagogues may pander to prejudices. Instead of trying to give you a factual account or an account rooted in social science to possibly correct received opinions, they may play on them and build on them, promote a paranoid worldview. Or, I think what goes on most of the time is simply position real, legitimate concerns and problems that people have in tendentious and not so realistic accounts of why they have those problems. Right? In this context, right, populism is sort of a wake-up call, but it's not a program. And one of the things we see in the case of Trump, and indeed in Brexit and some other cases, is that populists in power often don't have a full set of policies they want to introduce. That populism is about the grievances, not the aspirations. It's a politics of grievance, not of aspiration. It's negative in that sense. It's about what's gone wrong, rather than a program for what should go right. Yes, there's a program of America first, or Australia, or France, or whatever. There may be a nationalist program in that sense, but not a detailed program. It's not a plan. To look for the plan that is going to lift people economically in populist politics is to misunderstand, right? To think that it is a wonkish set of policy proposals rather than this more emotional reflection of grievances. Resentment. I use the ressentiment to give an evocation of Nietzsche, which I really mean. A sort of an emotion, right, of that defines oneself by what one resents about the state of the world, what one doesn't accept, about what other people are. Right? It's a weakening sort of sentiment, but a powerful sentiment nonetheless, to feel resentment, right? To be focused on what you don't have rather than what you have, or on the injustices and not the way forward. In populist politics, demands for recognition are typically central. For recognition in the classic Hegelian sense, for being seen and seen as legitimate. We're accustomed to thinking identity politics is all about minority groups and others who say they haven't been recognized fully. And that has produced lots of politics, and there's an important set of questions. But there's nothing to stop majority groups, or people who think they are the majority, from also saying they haven't been fully recognized, for saying, oh, the politicians in the Democratic Party always want to take care of the minorities, but not of the real Americans. The politicians in the mainstream want to take care of all those people who benefited from globalization and not those people who didn't, and so forth and so on. And it's not just about material benefits, it's about recognition. It's an identity politics in which natives or whites, or in the case of India, Hindus can say there's too much privilege being given to those Muslims. Right? So very large groups can feel they're not getting the recognition they're due, the respect they're due, the treatment they're due. And this can be very important to populism. Nonetheless, right, populist grievances are often fully justified. Right? That is, the complaints have a ground. Now, having justice behind your complaint doesn't mean you have a good analysis of what to do about it, and it doesn't mean you have a good analysis of what produced it. Right? But it does mean that there's a pointer to something, a wake-up call, as I call it. It's really true that the actual pattern of globalization in the last 40 or so years has been organized more to benefit elites and more to benefit moneyed interests than to benefit ordinary people. Right? Now, to recognize that as true, you don't have to say, therefore globalization is bad. You don't have to say, therefore we should be isolated. Therefore we should have protectionist policies. Therefore we should go to war. Right? You can harness the correct recognition to all sorts of very problematic views. But there is something important about this. It is the case that the ways in which the world globalized were shaped by the interests of business corporations and financial markets and others and elites in various ways, more than by the interests of ordinary people. So that the disappearance of manufacturing jobs wasn't just a natural process. It was something that was incentivized and something that was given a push by the particular way in which globalization was organized, and so forth. Now, in my view, globalization has been largely good. So I'm not arguing against globalization. I'm arguing that in the case of globalization, as almost anything else, there are different ways to do it. And you can do it in ways that benefit different people, that are more humane or less, and it's worth thinking about how that works, and who it works well for and who it works poorly for. Similarly, technological innovation has benefited lots of us. We probably all have smartphones and all like having smartphones, right? But there are still ways in which technological innovation has been built in to intensifying inequality in most of the OECD, the middle and upper income countries of the world, right? Partly because of the way it's produced automation. Now here we get a chance to see why having a sensible grievance doesn't necessarily give you a sensible view of where to go or a sensible analysis. Because you may recall images like Donald Trump going to a factory, a Carrier factory in Indiana, that made air conditioners, and saying he was going to bring jobs back from Mexico, he was going to save American industry. Right? That particular factory got a huge subsidy to try to keep its manufacturing in Indiana. What was the illusion? What was the catch? It's keeping its factory in the US by heavily automating it. So it's using the subsidy to buy machinery which in the long run will still put workers out of work. Right? It's not the case that foreign competition is the whole story of the transformation of labor markets in any of the world's countries. It is a combination of internationalization with automation and reorganization of industry. And it's often done in ways that hasn't protected very much the interests of ordinary people. They haven't gotten retraining, they haven't gotten adequate support for restarting other jobs, and in many cases they haven't gotten the chance to find ways to maintain what were, in fact, important parts of the economy. Manufacturing industry provided good jobs for a long time. Not wonderful jobs, not every manufacturing job was a delight, right? But relatively well-paid, relatively secure jobs from the period of World War II through to the 1970s, when an erosion began in manufacturing jobs in country after country. Right? This could have been seen as a problem, the damages of which should be mitigated, or, as was the case, an advance into a better technological future for those people with computer science degrees or shares in Google and Apple. Or just since I mentioned finance, think of the way global finance works. Finance can help us all. We want to buy a home, we can get a mortgage. You don't have to save for 30 years, you can borrow and pay it off for 30 years. Okay? There's a benefit for ordinary people. But we have moved from being societies with relatively low debt to societies with very high levels of debt. Personal debt and governmental and other kinds of large-scale debt. This entangles us in a set of relationships. Donald Trump and other American populists like to rail against China, which has been lending America money at an extraordinary rate for decades. Right? China has a big vested interest in American prosperity, as it turns out, or it won't get paid back. But in addition, all kinds of people are locked in various webs of relationships because they owe money on credit cards, they owe money on their houses, right? And companies, as we saw in the great financial crisis, right, are locked into enormous webs of counterparty debt that are extremely difficult to understand and lead to things like ordinary people losing jobs and often their houses in very large numbers while companies get bailed out by the government. You wonder why people resent what went on in the rescue of American capitalism in the early part of the Obama administration? They resent it because it was a rescue of the companies that didn't help them directly. Okay? Obama chose, whether for good reasons or bad, to bring in fairly conventional mainstream Wall Street sorts of leaders to try to manage. And I think he would have been pilloried and it would have been a horrible time for him if he had failed to bring back American capitalism. But nonetheless, people know, right, that billions of dollars went to rescue companies and that there was no direct action by the US government to help people who were losing their homes due to the mortgage crisis, even though they could hardly be blamed for the production of the mortgage crisis. In all of this, populism is, I think, more of a political style than it is an ideology. It's not left-wing, it's not right-wing, it's a style which may be embraced by left-wing or right-wing people. It's a way of doing politics that has several conventional features. I've mentioned some of these already. Pointing to Evita Peron, I mentioned this claim to give voice to the previously silent. I mentioned resentment. The idea that fair treatment based on membership should be basic. That's what links it to nationalism. Right? Sudden surges are important. It's not an ideology, left and right. And it works in contexts where there is a disruption of the society. So each of these historical examples come in the context of extraordinary social political change and often disruption. The Great Depression, for example, the 1890s crisis that affected agricultural markets around the world, the middle of the 20th century. Disruption, right, which causes the loss of existing safety nets. In the era of the early Industrial Revolution, that means loss of community, as migrants lose community and lose safety nets when they move abroad. But it also means the erosion. We've been going through decades of cutbacks and erosions in which you have to pay more and more to get what were free public services, and in which there have been shifts in the kind of protection that are available to people. Ilth is the great John Ruskin's term for the opposite of wealth. Right? Successful progress for some people often means ilth for others. Think of pollution, right? A byproduct. We measure the gross national product. We measure wealth as it's created, but we don't, in our national economic discourses, have a very clear way for measuring bad stuff. Right? So you get good stuff. Let's grant that it's good stuff. How do you measure the bad stuff? How do you measure, yes, industry created these jobs and this much wealth, but it created this much pollution of the water and soil erosion, right? Or whatever kinds of ilth are involved. And at the social level, inequality with its dramatic increases. And inclusion in the people has often come in a pattern of hierarchical incorporation. That is, benefits have expanded, but they've expanded in a way that pulls people into hierarchies. In education, for example, this was the great theme of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, some of you will have read. The false promises, right? Don't worry, you have to work hard, but your children can go to college. They will then get to be part of the elite. But then by the time they go to college, getting a college degree does not make them part of the elite. It depends on what you studied, which college, what marks you got. Actually, you may still get the same job your father had. You'll just have a college degree. Right? So there are potential false promises because we've extended the hierarchy, the amount of inequality in society, and embedded people in these webs of false promises. And we've built, I think, these systems of relatively distant integration. We have often sacrificed local community, local webs of knowing each other face to face, being connected to people, for fairly distant, more abstract systems. You know, who made the clothes you wear? It's conceivable that you bought them from craftspeople in local communities, but probably you bought them from very large stores that imported them when they were made in factories, and there is no way you could trace a person and say, oh, a person made my jacket. Now, human labor made my jacket. It wasn't just made by machines, though it's not a very expensive jacket, so it probably was partly made by machines, right? But I could never find that human. Well, that's a metaphor for something that's gone on in society generally. We're connected to all these people through very large systems globally and in our countries. And that's actually brought us a variety of benefits, like my not so expensive jacket. Okay? But it has also shifted a balance in our life. Remember I spoke before about ways of life, where we're embedded in ways of life. If we lose communities in which we share ways of life, but we gain some long-distance market relations, we need to ask, what's the trade-off? How does this work for us? And part of what has happened is that the rise of these very large-scale systems has benefited people like us more than it has benefited lots of other people. That is, it has benefited professionals. It has benefited the university educated. It has benefited the people who get jobs maintaining these large systems, whether it is a government bureaucracy and a job in the government, or it is the economic system and the jobs in global markets that are created. There are jobs created that go for people to maintain these systems at a large scale. But, right, the rise of the professions is part of this hierarchical organization of society. Not everybody gets that, and not the people, for the most part, who lose the other jobs. It is not the case, whatever anyone tells you, I'm very confident in this, it is not the case that most mine workers can get jobs as computer programmers. There are little programs that try to retrain mine workers to be computer programmers. They have negligible success rates in the market. It simply isn't a feasible agenda to take all the people who lose their jobs in the mines and get them jobs in the computer industry. It was this way back when William Cobbett, that English populist, was alive. He was alive and wrote about the Luddites and helped make famous the so-called Luddites. Framework knitters in 1811, 12, who lost their livelihood as new technologies came in. New technologies that benefited consumers in the cities because they could get cheaper shirts, but did not benefit the people who were working machinery. And they were people who had lived in small communities disproportionately around the country, who had moved into framework knitting because it was a good occupation. It was a bottleneck. Knitting was a relative bottleneck because spinning mechanized faster first. Okay? But the real point about the Luddites is they were not wrong. The word has come to be used for anti-technology, backward-oriented people. But what happened with the Luddites is that when their line of work was destroyed by new technology being deployed by larger scale capital into their firms, their communities were destroyed. They faced choices about migrating right? Or going hungry, right? And many small towns lost their main economic organization. So then they lost a bit of way of life. They lost their connections to each other, they lost the local culture, they lost the local football team, they lost the local pub. But also, right, England got richer. It is not the case that England got poorer because of the Industrial Revolution. But it was 100 years before the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Luddites earned as much as the framework knitters had earned in relative terms. That is, wages didn't bounce back immediately. And we live in an era when many people who had good working class jobs are losing them. And we say, don't worry, the technology will benefit you all. But it may benefit you all after a 100-year lag with no guarantee. And when wages bounced back, it was not just because of growth in the system. It was because of the trade union movement. It was because of actual pressure on employers to pay higher wages as the labor movement took off. So there aren't simple guarantees. I don't think that most of the populist politicians are offering solutions, but there are responses to these various sorts of problems. Populism also, as a political style, reflects a collapse in trust. Trust in each other, trust that you're going to get what you should get from the government. So there's an issue of trust in government. In almost every advanced democracy, there are unprecedentedly low levels of trust in government. Now, it varies. Trust in government has fallen from about 60% to around 20% in the United States. In Norway, it's fallen from about 95% to 75%, but it's still fallen, right? So there are places where people trust the government more, okay? But there has been a widespread loss of trust. Sometimes that has to do with the idea of corruption. People are literally stealing, right? Sometimes just with the politics of recognition. They're taking care of someone else, not my people, right? The loss of trust is not just in the government. It's in political parties. A key feature behind populism is the loss of trust, faith in conventional political parties. The political party system is in large part broken. People don't think, it's not just that they think one party's bad and the other's good, they don't think any of them really speak to what they need and want to a very large extent. They think they're all full of people who are just seeking office to benefit themselves, or that they are representing other people, not them, or that they've made so many compromises that you can't even tell what they stand for anymore. But in general, the party system doesn't work very well. Political party affiliation is a weaker and weaker part of the electoral process. Now, this is important. Remember, I referred to interest groups before. Part of what parties do when they work well is forge compromises. Bring groups of people together, all of whom will get some of what they want, and none of whom will get everything they want. But they cooperate in order to achieve electoral majorities. That doesn't go on very much. And in fact, many of us were very pleased, even celebratory, over the defeat of the National Front and Marine Le Pen in France, and said, oh, the wonderful Emmanuel Macron, who is actually a very nice guy, who won against all political parties. His victory, was a sign, perhaps good for him and for some things, but very bad for the way French democracy has worked, because no established political party was responsible. He left the socialists, who got 5% of the vote, more or less irrelevant political party now. He forged a movement called En Marche, but not yet a party, raising questions about his majority. But I don't want to go into the French analysis so far as just say, note, all parties failed in this election by a fairly strong majority of a technocratic, globalist, Europeanist in France. Parties are institutions. Trade unions have eroded. Trade unions are a more or less negligible force in most of the countries of the OECD, of the West. There are a few exceptions. They matter more in Chile than they matter in the US. They matter in some places. They matter more in Australia than they matter in the US, but they matter a lot less than they used to in Australia. Right? So a whole series of institutions. Think of churches, not because churches were so political, but they were places where people came together and knew each other and sometimes had a sense of confidence and trust in the people they knew together. But churches mobilize a vastly smaller part of the population. So we have a crisis of trust that is then exacerbated when the media are able to target different people and they stay within their zone of people who believe the same thing. We don't have institutions that form compromises, that create a political center, that bring us together in various ways. And us, the liberal elites, have to acknowledge that some of the problems involve things that have benefited us, or at least people like us. That we may not have been neoliberals, we may have criticized neoliberals, we may have been Marxist academic sociologists, but we also wanted promotions and universities with better pay and refurbishment of the buildings and a credit system that would enable us to buy cars. I meant to look up the number for Australia and don't know it, of the proportion of the population that own cars, but it has dramatically increased, right? I mean, so many of us are complicit. We say, okay, I don't like this, I criticize the government, I vote for the Labour Party, but, things go on. We haven't looked in the same way at the places where there is depopulation in the inland of rural or small town areas. We haven't looked at the radically increased inequality as much as we might have until the financial crisis. There are a lot of things we haven't looked at, including reversals in the provision of public goods. Of course we see the big dangers that are there, but we need to recognize that when a lot of people criticize the liberal elites, it's not without some reason that they're talking about us. As Walt Kelly put it in an American cartoon. We spend too much of our time being angry at the populists, not enough of our time being angry at the betrayal of the broad public interest in our societies. To address any of these issues would require us to rebuild social solidarity, to rebuild the cohesion of our societies. There's no addressing it just by giving a different political announcement. It would take rebuilding this, having moral economies, reintroducing the idea that there could be moral values and social values in the economy, that there is not something that is written in nature that says the economy must be approached with no other analytic metric besides profit and the accumulation of capital. Why can't it be approached asking whether it creates jobs? Why can't it be approached asking whether there are good jobs for people? Why can't it be approached asking whether the economy delivers on moral and social solidarity in society? Well, it can be. It just isn't most of the time. And we can build more inclusive and egalitarian ways of understanding our society. We can respond to the transformative role of technology, capitalism, globalization, and say, on balance, these are good. I like globalization, I like new technologies, but I want to manage our transition in a way which does not sacrifice all aspects of local community, and that doesn't sacrifice relative social equality. So how can we have globalization, smartphones, and greater social equality? It's a reasonable question to ask, and it's not completely impossible. But it's not on the agenda most of the time because we allow the development of technology to proceed in more or less unregulated ways based on what can make profit for companies. This is actually pretty normal for the hundreds of years of modern capitalism. And I don't think it's realistic to say that the capitalists bear all the responsibility. We all do. When there is dramatic change, including new technologies, how we rebuild support systems is crucial. When the old support systems don't work as well, how do we create new ones? These are the questions we have to be asking ourselves. We need social changes that will build integration of our societies in order to be able to have a more effective politics. democratic agendas can't just be technical fixes to the economy or to other large-scale systems. For 40 years, the liberal agenda has been, we will do a better job technically at managing the economy or the healthcare system or the education system or this other. It needs to be, we will come together and restore social cohesion. I close with a quote from the wonderful G.K. Chesterton, right? Noting that we face deep systemic challenges. Chesterton said, "The whole modern world has divided itself into conservatives and progressives." That's polarization. The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of the conservatives is to prevent the mistakes from being corrected. That's not a happy situation. Small wonder that some people object. Thanks.
I'm not going away. I'm just letting you go to the center.
Thank you, Craig. I'm assuming that people will have questions, comments, discussion, and I'm opening up the floor. So. Back here.
Yeah, hey.
Craig, I enjoyed your paper very much. It's a very good paper. I agreed with much of it, though not the conclusion. And that's what I'm going to focus my question on. I want to go back to the point where you talk about the false promises of elites. I think you used two very instructive examples. One was the universities, which simply abysmally failed to deliver their promise and grew rich and fat and greedy on the basis of the false promises that they made to generations of students who were never ever going to become doctors and lawyers and so forth. And then there was the other instructive example of the carrier manufacturing firm, which along with the president and vice president promised jobs, but in fact, as you rightly pointed out, they will, and other companies like them, will use the money that they receive from state and federal governments to finance automation. And I think automation is a normal and natural part of industrial societies, and we are where we are today because of the processes of automation that began at the end of the 18th century. And you end with both a critique of the elites, which I think is honest and interesting critique of the elite, and that you don't use populism as an excuse to defend the behaviour of elite institutions.
Excuse me, the question's too long. We need to be able to hear the question.
Yeah, it is a very long question, and
But it's really interesting how the voice from on high responds to it.
in that I was going to ask Craig to summarise the question because the regents can't hear the question, so we either need to get you to come down, and I don't think we want that repeated.
So hit me with the key question.
Yeah, what's your key question? And then Craig can repeat that when he answers.
I get it. You end with a critical note on the elites, but at the same time you ask for, essentially you have a statement about moral solidarity and so forth, which I think actually just continues a version of what we have already experienced in the last 40 years. I think what the elites face today is overgrown.
Please stop the question.
Oh, please. Overgrown institutions that need to be reduced and made much more lean. So here's my question now. When, as is beginning, artificial intelligence really hits, and that we have automation not just of factories, which we've had over the last 40 years, but we have automation of accountancy, automation of the universities, automation of schooling, and so on and so forth, then how are the elites going to respond to the shrinking of their own, let's say, fat body?
All right, I'm going to try to summarize this very briefly, and it will no doubt not include everything that Peter brought up. Automation is a normal process of modern advances in science, technology, and industrial capitalism, and it produces benefits as well as problems. We potentially face massive new levels of automation and therefore massive unemployment and changes in labor markets because of artificial intelligence. And the question then is calling for social solidarity and a more moral economy going to do anything about this? And will elites do anything about it, or will they just continue to find ways to live well? And the recent past, in which many institutions became bloated, I believe is your word, is an example of elites living well at public expense. Am I reasonably on target?
I think it's perfect.
Okay. Now, let me say I agree that automation is normal. Well, actually, normal's not a word I love, but that it is a normal part of the processes of modern industrial capitalist societies to continue to improve technologies, both technologies that are marketed to people, your smartphones, and the technologies of production themselves, which are what eliminate the jobs. And so if smartphones were all made by individual human beings, there would be no labor market problem with having the new technology. It's really the transformation of the production that is most critical. Artificial intelligence is going to produce radical changes, I believe, potentially so radical that it breaks the relationship between employment and income. For hundreds of years, employment has been the main way in which people get the income to live in society. A few people are really rich and have inherited wealth, and a few people are poor enough that they're on welfare and otherwise dependent. But for most of the population, employment is the key. Okay? Now, if there is a break in that relationship, if so many jobs are eliminated that ceases to be the normal relationship, this is a huge problem for modern societies. Now, I understand Peter rightly. He's saying those people who've been running the institutions won't do much of anything about this and maybe can't. And I am sympathetic that there's an entirely good chance, because I don't see anybody doing very good planning about this, that's the case. What would it mean to do something about it? Is it possible to do something about it? Peter says that big institutions, including universities, become bloated and have grown. Well, the growth in the university sector includes growth in things that are good and things that are not so good. And it has a very mixed bag. So we could be delivering more and better education to more people at lower cost. And the cost of the sector is a problem. Okay? Nobody ever thinks their own salary is a problem or the space size of their own office or all those things. But I just want to agree and move on. It's a problem. Right? It's a problem in all sorts of big institutional arenas. And it is the case that the next wave of automation will automate many highly skilled and currently highly paid jobs. This is exactly what happened to those poor framework knitters, the Luddites, after all. They were highly skilled workers in England of early 19th century. They had learned the skill of a new technology, framework knitting, as opposed to old traditional knitting. And they were doing pretty well. They were like radiographers, the people who read your x-rays. It's a skilled job, they're well paid, they're part of a medical system that supports them, and those jobs can not just be automated and save money, they can work better. Artificial intelligence can read the x-rays better. There will be a variety of other changes that kind, so scary future. Now, I don't think this has to mean a future without work. But one possibility, many people say, is it will mean a future without work. And the solution is to have guaranteed national incomes, and then people will do whatever they want with their money. I'm skeptical of that solution, though I think it's better than nothing. I'm skeptical first because I think what it's doing is trying to keep people tied into the market by doing everything through income in various ways, but mainly because I fear that without meaningful work and without a rebuilding of social cohesion, and what I called a moral economy, what this will do is finance an ever-growing opiate epidemic as people with money but no occupations and meaningful work and so forth abuse drugs. And that's just it's partly a real problem, and it's partly a metaphor for engaging in a variety of other activities that aren't particularly wonderful. The alternative is to imagine that work is not just for money, to ask how we might create a society in which there are ways for people to express themselves in the work. We can be idealistic and say they should be artists and novelists. We can talk about the care economy. Why are some of the lowest paid jobs in our society taking care of people in ways that are not easily automated? Why can't we transfer our wealth that is partly created on the basis of the automation in the industry into being able to support society? This is what I mean by social cohesion. Support caring for each other, support communities, say that those are goals, not just the accumulation of capital. And I think we can. I don't think that's just an unrealistic, completely off the wall expectation. I think it may even be a necessity. Now, why we don't, and this is in part an answer to what I think is the implied question from Peter, because I don't think he was really questioning whether it's possible or impossible, whether there would be any will on the part of the privileged elites to do it. Am I right? Yeah. I think that it is because they're privileged, and they will try to cling to their privilege for a long time. But in particular, there's an ideology that supports that, a really pernicious ideology called meritocracy. I refer you to Michael Young, a great sociologist, former Labour minister in Britain, who wrote a wonderful book called The Rise of Meritocracy. Among the many great uses of this book, when I used to sign it in teaching, you could tell for sure which students read the book, because the ones who didn't read the book all told you what a good thing meritocracy was and how progress in modern society meant that highly educated people like themselves got all the good jobs and made all the big decisions and everything was great. Of course, at the end of the book, there is a populist revolt in which the meritocracy is overthrown. And the only thing that was wrong in Young's account is he said that'll probably come around the late 2020s. So it came a little sooner. But, right, it's a realistic thing. Now, what's the catch to the meritocracy? It tells those liberal elites and people like us generally that we are in our positions of privileges because we're smarter than everybody else. It's because we did so well on our examinations in school that we enjoy privileges. It's because we succeed in jobs. And this is a reigning ideology, for example, in Silicon Valley, where people sitting atop these fantastic amounts of money, billionaires and tens of billions and even larger fortunes, and companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft and so forth, really, to a very large extent, believe that 90% of the human race will be redundant and superfluous, and our challenge is just to get through that period without a revolt. So I think that we have an ideology of a ruling class that is a problem. We need to challenge that. But we, unfortunately, in the educational institutions have been supporting it, have been an underpinning for that ideology instead of a challenge, instead of finding a way to question whether 90% of the human race or 98% of the human race really should be thought of as redundant and excessive, whether the people in our societies who don't have jobs just because they failed their exams, or whether the idea of a perfect meritocracy is not a particularly good way of organizing society. Now, we don't have a perfect meritocracy, I hasten to say. It's not that really the prime ministers of the world all did so much better in school or have perfect merit compared to the others, but it's an ideology that legitimates those people who enjoy success, believing that the success is due entirely to their own abilities and efforts, rather than to the structure of society and the contributions of a whole variety of other people, which in fact is the only way anyone gets to be successful.
I might just give the Regents the opportunity to ask a question. Bendigo
Ask them,
or
can they actually hear us?
Mildura. Any questions? No? Edgar?
I probably said enough. Jerry and Dee are very wise people here. They probably have an observation. If you keep it short, my friend.
Okay, we'll move on to short questions here, which will be summarised.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Craig. That was really fantastic. I guess two questions. The first one, they're related to each other. The first question is, given the amount of resentment which you kindly glazed over in your presentation, the amount of resentment circulating in global society, and this desire to generate a kind of moral solidarity, is there actually a way to overcome that? And if so, whose responsibility, and I use responsibility purposefully here, is it to be able to overcome this tension? Is it the civil society, or does this come from the political institutions themselves?
Okay, so is it possible to overcome the high levels of resentment to which I pointed, and if so, whose responsibility is it to do something about it? The second question, it's our responsibility along with others. It has to be seen as widely shared. Responsibility can be interpreted in two senses. That is, we could mean, do we owe that responsibility? And I think there's a good case that in many ways we do in return for good life. But what I mean even more is we are faced with an enormous potential social change which could go really badly. And the responsibility for averting that is shared among all the members of the society going through the social change. Separately, in fact, tomorrow afternoon, I will say why I don't think nationalism is all bad. And part of the answer is I think it's mainly in national context that we can do this. So that doesn't mean don't work on the global scale, don't join the World Social Forum, but it means that it's mainly in democratic nation states that there are opportunities for civil society and for ordinary people and people who write in the media and so forth to work on these things and change policies. And therefore, we shouldn't dismiss all appeals to the nation as bad. We should act on them. So that's what I mean by all of us. Now, the first question is harder, and I sadly don't have a panacea to offer. That is, I do believe it's possible to work on this. I think I need to believe that because I don't want to live thinking, oh, damn, the world's just all going to fall apart. I want to believe we can do something. So partly it's because I want to, not because I intellectually know it's possible. But I do believe there are things to do, and that's what I'm trying to point to by saying, let's challenge the idea that there can be no discourse of values in the economy. Let's work to build social cohesion, which requires analyzing why it's being undermined. Why are so many small to medium-sized communities being depopulated? One of the stories of France in this Macron-Le Pen thing is the decline of traditional French villages and small towns, which is shaped by economic decline and by state policy that has shifted the way subsidies and things are organized. We should look at those things, and it will be many small actions, I think, not one huge masterstroke. If we just do this, it will all be okay. But I think we can introduce the positive value of building social cohesion into it, and it will be more productive than just attacking the populists if we try to build something of the cohesion and build the connections. I gave the example of the draft. Let me say, I think that national service is a good idea, bringing people from different parts of countries together in national service. It shouldn't be only military service, but that using some form of compulsory national service to make sure that there is more social mixing and that certain sorts of tasks get done, whether it's military defense work or it's reforestation. But these are things that can be done. So there are policies like that to pursue.
This is probably a little bit related to that. You talked about the decline of major political parties, and I sort of got the sense that you saw that as not a great thing. So, what do you think are the prospects for major political parties having a comeback, in a sense? Sorry?
So is there much chance for a revival, a renewal of major political parties? I think you're both asking the same thing. Well, okay, let me just answer the first question. I think there's not much chance. And then if it's necessary, oh, shoot. But I don't think it's entirely necessary. That is, I think we could have a real restructuring. So, let me answer this in a more orderly fashion. I think the chances that this problem will get addressed by simply rebuilding the existing political parties are very, very low. I think the chances that something like political parties might be rebuilt in a reorganized model with different political parties, different alignments. What political parties do is package. So we have, our political parties have been based on what looked like left and right 50 years ago. And sometimes those packagings don't work very well, and that's part of the problem. But the trust issue is not just ideological. It really is that the parties don't work very well, and that democracy may need to be partially rethought. We've become very dependent on large-scale electoral democracy once every few years, and not taking much care of our democratic societies between elections. That may have to change if we want to make democracy work. I should say, we might not want that. We might think that something like the Chinese system is desirable. Why have mass democracy so long as you can have a good way of choosing local level leaders? Well, is that true of China? I don't think so much, but that is the argument of the Confucian government analysis, that there is a way to not have large-scale democracy but have good selection processes. It's close to the meritocracy argument. I personally think that without some way of having a public voice, this doesn't get solved. But I think newspapers, television, political parties, a bunch of institutions, universities, are all in a fair amount of trouble in the current era, and we're going to have to reinvent them. And I don't know the reinvention, and I don't know whether it will include something called political parties or not. I think that's an open question. For what it's worth, we'll say the same about the media, right? I think that the chances that we will return to really robust publishing models of print media are very, very small, but I don't know exactly what the new media model is going to be. I could describe some of what's going on now with social media and different things, but I couldn't tell you where it's going to land.
Have you got any examples of, in Europe and America, in democratic societies, of attempts at new forms of social solidarity and moral economy and
Sure.
social coalition building? Because in many respects, most of us are veterans of post-Marxist, post-feminists, and all went hunting for new social movements in the 90s and ended up with identity politics of difference rather than coalition building of building out trust between different groups. So have you got some examples of, however
I'll
small,
try.
of what?
So there are lots of small examples. I'll give a couple, but I think there's a catch in the fact that they're small. Right? I think part of what we learned is that building urban cooperatives, creating an alternative economy in which people are trading various kinds of services or goods with each other in local areas does create interesting alternatives. I think that significant parts of Southern Europe would not have survived the financial crisis without this. So in a place like Barcelona, the fact that there is a really active local alternative economy is really helpful. Because many families wind up in a situation where only one member of an extended family of 15 is working, but is working in a paid employment, but others are economically active in more informal ways. So the informal can be a story. It scales extremely poorly, right? It works in local relations. It doesn't scale up very well. And so, what is going to replace socialism, or is socialism going to get renewed as a large-scale vision of how this might work? Interesting question. Socialism ran into some of these same problems about bureaucracies and things. There are other examples of people trying to do some of these solidarity enhancing things, and I chose to refer to national service because it's a sort of conventional political thing that could actually be good, as opposed to simply building an alternative in civil society, a sort of anarchist choice. There are people writing and thinking about this, and there are people experimenting in lots of local ways. To say civil society is such a broad term. I mean, I remember Agnes Heller, a local patron saint, sort of saying, it's hard to remember why we said civil society. We just meant society. Right? And so sometimes civil means the good part of society that we like. Now, right? And so we don't like big corporations, they don't count. Actually, I think some big corporations do some pretty good and interesting things in terms of providing support systems to their employees. It makes employment in those corporations a privilege, right? But it's not without some level of care for the employees. So international corporate capitalists were way ahead of the national government or other vehicles for providing antiretroviral therapy in South Africa, for example. And now it created a two-tier system. I'm not saying that was perfect, but there are occasions where people in corporations show more solidarity with their workers than others. I think if we rule off the table all those parts of society that we don't like, the military or the corporations or something, whoever the we is, it won't work. We have to ask how society gets reorganized in a more general way, and that brings back to the identity politics. So it's true that often identity politics ended up being the claims of different people with different more or less preset identities. But that was a sad distortion of some of the visions of people thinking about that, say a Charles Taylor or someone, because what they were recognizing was everybody needs recognition, that these things change, that they're not preset and fixed, or as I put it, there are politics of identity in, say, the idea of the working class. It's not do you have class politics or identity politics. Working class is an identity. It's reproduced in various settings like union halls, and it's as against craft separatism, right? Should a whole bunch of different craft unions form and not working class solidarity? Should there be solidarity of the workers? And I bring that up because I think what we're talking about is a need to work on the cultural as well as the material front. That is, we need to do a kind of remaking of identity together, remaking what holds us together as societies and who we are in that. And so if you want to call it identity politics, there's a version of that, but it's not basing politics on the identities we already have that divide us. It's recognizing that it's a political process when we remake identities. The great modern model of this is the women's movement in its early years, which was as much about changing self-understandings as it was about political voice based on the simple ascription of identity. Sorry, you're circling the role.
You pointed out there's a big difference in faith in government between Norway, which I think you said was 75%.
Yeah, I hope I got the numbers right, but yeah, something on that order. It's high.
And USA much less. Why do you think there is such a big difference? How do you explain that?
Small country.
Repeat that.
Oh, sorry, repeat the question. The question is, why would there be a big difference in which I reported Norwegians showing much more trust in their government than Americans? And the reasons are small country versus large, more culturally integrated versus less. Government actually really does work better versus government doesn't really work better. And relatively equal versus relatively unequal. And on the last, the quick example, so Norway has seen an explosion of inequality, and there's lots of national anxiety about inequality because people are tolerating levels that are twice what they used to tolerate, maybe sometimes even more, right? Those are dramatically lower than ever it was in the United States. So the World Values Survey asks a question, what do you think is an acceptable ratio between the top paid people and the bottom paid people in a company? And in Norway, the answer was for a long time about 3.5 to 1, and it's gone up to something like 8 to 1 or something, right? In the United States, it's gone from something like 100 to 700 to 1, right? So that the tolerance for inequality is just off the charts different, and the actual inequality is of the same magnitude. And so I no longer remember the precise numbers comparing actual inequality to the survey result, but the point is Americans both think of themselves in less social terms and less egalitarian terms, and American society is organized so there is much more dramatic inequality, and they're not wrong to think of themselves that way. I like Norway, in case you hadn't gotten the idea. It's very cold, though.
I have a historian's question.
Yeah.
It's about, you seem to not discuss the higher probability of war, but as a historian, after 2 great ages of ressentiment, the obvious way to rebuild social cohesion
War, yeah.
was war.
Yeah.
And we've been through that twice in the last 150 years. So, but you clearly are not worried about that.
No, I am giving 2 lectures, and that's in my nationalism lecture for tomorrow. But I agree completely. The historian's question was, doesn't history suggest to us that war will look to some leaders like an available way to rebuild trust and cohesion? And the answer from me is yes, it will, and that's very worrying. And of course, it doesn't just look like a way of rebuilding trust and cohesion. It solves various other problems for leaders sometimes, like rebuilding their own electoral fortunes when they're very low. So I worry about war. I worry about pandemic diseases. I worry about a variety of things that could upset our apple cart besides this issue of achieving social cohesion and so forth. But I should have made more clear that I think it. And I think war is on the table for a different historical reason as well, which is that every time global hegemony and leadership has shifted in the history of modern capitalism, that is back to the Dutch and so forth, it has involved large-scale conflict. I hope that that's not the case with the rise of Asia and the decline of the US, but it's a worry. The so-called, Thucydides wrote about this. It's back to very old historians. And I think it's quite realistic. So what we saw, you said the 2 big examples in the world wars, it's really, I think, one big example. I think that we see an enormous conflict between essentially the same sides, with 1 or 2 small differences, that we call the 2 world wars and the Great Depression. So what we see is this period of about 30 years of massive conflict and economic upheaval and crisis, which was in part the shifting of dominance from Britain to the US, faced with the possibility that Germany and Japan and others would intercept that progress and become the dominant powers. Could there be that conflict between China and the US or other Asian countries? Yes, there could be. And it could be almost by accident, because leaders in China are certainly saying they recognize that problem. They call it the Thucydides trap. They don't want to fall into it. But could there be a conflict that gets out of hand and spins out of control? Sure. With an amateurish populist president? More likely. Somebody asked me something I can answer in a really positive, optimistic way.
Yeah. Only optimistic questions now allowed.
Craig, I was wondering when you discussed at the beginning of the talk about the left-wing populist leaders, not it being a right-wing phenomenon. I was thinking about all the Latin American leaders and maybe even Iglesias and Tsipras.
Yep.
And I was wondering, how would you distinguish a left-wing populist leader from a left-wing party candidate? That is the first question. And the second question, do you think that a trait between left-wing populist leaders has to do with looking for solidarity in not only within their own countries, but with brother countries, like they did between Spain and Greece at a certain moment? or like Chavez did with
Yeah.
Lula and other countries
Right.
in Latin America?
So the two questions are, how do we tell the difference between a left-wing populist and just a left-wing position full stop? And what's the relationship between the domestic politics of a populism and solidarity at an international level with other like-minded or similarly suffering countries? Really good questions. I'll try to be brief since a sign is flashing about how we're running out of time and we just lost Muldura. The first question, I think, is the difference between a class conflict strategy and an attempt to unify the country around a broad strategy. So Chavez, for example, wasn't above talking about class, but basically suggested that the international situation of oppression and expropriation that confronted the country meant that most Venezuelans should join together in the movement, and saw a danger in a technocratic class project as opposed to popular mobilization. So some left-wing parties have been not largely about mobilizing the people for participation in political leadership, but about technocratically pursuing property changes and other changes in the system that would potentially benefit the communist parties in many places, for example. And I think the left populist strategy is one of appealing to the people, A, beyond just the classic working class and to the peasants, to others, and B, to participate, not merely to vote and be beneficiaries or something. As to the more international question, I actually don't think this is all about populism, but I think that there are interesting questions about solidarity among leaders and countries that are in some way trying to change an international system and create solidarity. We're at a point where nation states can't handle the problems that globalization throws at them, but there is no other effective solidarity and agency beyond the nation state level. There are experiments like the EU, not going quite so well. I hope it goes better in the future. The various Latin American projects before the Chavistas and the particular group of the so-called Bolivarian revolutionaries and so forth, all were dominated by classic economic development agendas. So the OAS or the Mercosur and these are all classic developmentalist things. And the idea that is most links domestic populism to the international agenda is sharing. And I think in the case of Greece and Spain too, but the idea that there are ways in which sharing could be beneficial. So we have oil, says Venezuela, you have other things. And so at that level, it's like a scaling up of the bartering and sharing economies of, say, Barcelona to something bigger. It didn't work all that well, but I think there's a commendable impulse to it. Does that answer the question? Yeah, okay.
We've probably got time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Yeah, I'm still formulating it a bit in my head, so apologies, but I was just wondering where the environment might figure in all of this, and what form of government, party system, solidarity, whether it's based on sort of more populist or whether it's more of a localized sort of forms of solidarity might help us in this
Great. Now I will try to formulate a brief answer rather than a long one. It's a really important question. And I'm glad that you said environment, not just climate. Because I think one of the things that has happened is that climate change has come to dominate all discussions of the environment in many settings and to lend itself to a highly technocratic understanding of what to do. We have to find fixes for it. Now, by technocratic, I don't just mean solar panels or new technologies. I mean the idea that it's recognized that there is a highly complex system of interdependencies. It's hard to understand. We need specialists to work on it in some sense, and action through the Paris Accords then gets mediated through economists who are worrying about how can you align cap and trade agreements, so they'll do that, which means having the finance industry become the arbiter of a climate change solution. So that these are genuine problems, and cap and trade being better aligned and larger market structures might really be helpful, but it's the opposite of participatory. It's the opposite of connecting the local into the bigger picture. It's the opposite of recognizing, if you will, a moral economy to this, which I think is the source of the movement that has in fact brought this forward. And so I worry that turning the climate discussion or any other environmental discussion into a call for purely technical solutions undermines the depth of response we need. That's point one. That doesn't mean we don't need technical solutions, that we shouldn't have oceanographers and all, people working on this, but that won't be sufficient. Point two, environmental problems, pollution, the soil erosion, degradation of land, water supply issues are also real net of climate change. So climate change is extremely important. It will make these things worse, but they're all very immediate. If we can get that more connected up, that's better. And then it's very connected to immediately experienced social phenomena like the life of a community when it is subjected to these environmental problems. And it becomes a very powerful part of what I called ILF, following Ruskin, the environmental justice movement, for example, that tries to look at who bears the burden of the accumulation of ILF, say in the form of garbage or in the form of toxic waste or in the form of polluted water, and showing how that's organized does connect this up to the organization of society in a way that the more abstract discussions of lowering carbon footprint slightly doesn't. And so I would hope these could be reconnected in that sense. And the environmental movements, these things are all important. So we may suffer catastrophic water problems even before we suffer catastrophic rising ocean levels. We've got lots of bad things happening at once and a sort of race among them. So I worry that this looks to many people like one more occasion for technocratic top-level action. Now, that said, the populist movements have a terrible track record on the environment, right? So this is not something where I can defend the actually existing populist movements for the most part, most of which have been worried about the short-term circumstances of the people who are mobilized in them in such a way that they haven't worried very much about environment, and they've even been a force for reversing environmental policies and priorities. Think, Donald Trump relaxing pollution controls to reopen coal mines. A classic populist gesture. If you're in a town that was devastated by the closing of the coal mine, it feels good, but it's not a long-range solution to anything.
Trevor, I think you want to come up and say something?
Just before we close, I'd like to do a quick advert. Alas, we only have the presence of Craig and his extraordinary partner, Pam Delagi, for another 36 hours, I think it is. They fly out to LA Thursday morning, and there are two more events in which we can get a chance to listen and talk with Craig. That they're organised by Thesis 11, and they're both at the Collins Street City campus. The 6 o'clock public lecture is on Do Nations Matter? And so Craig will be spelling out some of the implications of some of the things he said today, but also bringing different angles on that discussion. Also, if you're interested, you will notice that Craig's training and practices are right across the spectrum of humanities and social sciences. And so if you're interested in thinking about research in a multidisciplinary setting and all the challenges of that across the recent years and recent decades, then there'll be a Q&A session at 3 o'clock at the Collins Street campus on which we'll be asking questions of Craig about a life in social and political theory. So they're the two events at Collins Street, one at 3 and the larger public lecture at 6 p.m. And I just want to also mention a word about the sponsors. The initial money came from the Office of the Vice-Chancellor as part of the 50th anniversary. A very generous donation vote from Tony McGrew as the PVC of our college, and Thesis 11 Journal, not not the Centre doesn't have any money, but the Journal. And I'd also like to acknowledge too the terrific socially cohesive and moral economy of folks that just stepped forward and volunteered. So I'd like to say thanks to the two RFA groups, THS, Transforming Human Societies, which is an appropriate title, and Building Healthy Communities. Both of them have come in and supported different events and making sure things happen. To the folks at the Bendigo campus that helped host Pam Delagi's visit, thank you very much. And also to Katie Holmes as the new director of the Centre for the Study of Inland. So all these folks came together. There's too many folks to name, but it was at a short time and when everybody's very busy. So I'm very grateful for the support you've shown. So thanks, and do try and make an effort in your busy schedules to come tomorrow.
And happy birthday, Latrobe.
Thank you. And let me ask you to put your hands together again and thank Professor Calhoun for a really stimulating session.